Hello everyone. So when we last left off, the United States had been attacked with the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, and that drew them into the war. After the United States was drawn into the war, they held a meeting with the other leaders of the Allied powers and came to the agreement that they would defeat Germany first. And after the defeat of Germany, they would focus on Japan. And even though this was agreed upon, the United States decided that it was going to take the brunt of the fighting in the Pacific by itself to try and defeat Japan. So by the end of 1942, Japan had already conquered Burma, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, the Philippines, and Rabaul. They were bombing Australia and continuing their fight against the nationalists and communists in China. And while Japan was having great success against the unprepared Americans in the Pacific, they'd become overconfident and overextended, unable to actually control and defend the massive empire that they had built so quickly. The United States strategy was to island hop, taking each island in the Pacific one by one back from the Japanese. In taking these islands, the US could then build air bases on them from which they could launch air raids on other islands, as well as attack Japanese ships. The Japanese strategy became one of trying to knock America out of the war by sinking their aircraft carriers and cutting them off from the help of the Australians, which had become a major logistical center for the Allies. A major turning point in the Pacific War was the Battle of Midway. The United States had broken the Japanese radio codes, which had been deemed to be unbreakable, and were able to interpret their battleship movements. Using this newly gained information, the American fleet was able to sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and a heavy cruiser, but also shot down around 250 aircraft. The significance of this battle can't be overstated. Had the US lost the Battle of Midway, Japan would have had supremacy in the Pacific, and they would have been able to invade Fiji, Samoa, and even Hawaii. After the Battle of Midway, the United States had made its goal to liberate the Solomon Islands, primarily Guadalcanal, from the Japanese. The Japanese made it their goal to hold on to Guadalcanal and to redirect many of their forces in the area to it. The casualties on Guadalcanal were staggering. Over 7,000 Americans would die, and there were 7,000 wounded, and a loss of 29 ships and 615 aircraft. For Japan, 19,000 dead, 38 ships, and 683 aircraft. It was one of the most prolonged battles of the Pacific, lasting 6 months and consisting of 3 major land battles and 7 major naval battles. The Japanese soldier had been long indoctrinated that surrender was to dishonor family and that to commit suicide was preferable than surrender. This resulted in many last-ditch suicide charges by Japanese soldiers, as well as some soldiers blowing themselves up with grenades when they ran out of ammo. Following the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Americans were fully on the offensive and Japan was finally on the defensive. With the combined support of Australian and New Zealand forces, they began retaking Rabaul, the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, Caroline Islands, and then Western New Guinea. The writing was on the wall for Japan's leaders. They were not going to win this war at this point, and they had hoped to hold on to their territorial gains. It was also clear at this point in the war that the aircraft carriers would dominate naval actions in modern war. In China, though, the Japanese mounted a new counteroffensive to try and capture American airfields there. They dealt a stinging blow to the nationalist Chinese forces, and it led to a deterioration in relations between America and the national Chinese. The communist Chinese in the north, led by Mao Zedong, were using this time to build up their own forces to not only take China from the Japanese, but also from the nationalists. While the Japanese counteroffensive was massively successful in taking territory from China, it hurt them in the long run as they were unable to defend that territory they had taken. In June 1944, the US had won another major naval battle against the Japanese at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The significance of the Battle of the Philippine Sea can be seen in terms of industrial power of both countries. Having lost another 3 carriers, Japan had now lost 9 total in the war, while the US had only lost 3. But Japan was not able to replace a single one of those carriers that they had lost, whereas the United States would go on to build a total of 25 carriers during the war. Moreover, Japan had lost almost every experienced pilot it had at that point, as well as most of its naval aircraft. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japan hid its devastating defeat from the public, and Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was forced to resign. Japan had also now become increasingly dependent on the use of its kamikaze tactic, where they would fly their aircraft straight into the enemy ships in a suicidal attempt to sink them. In October, the Battle of Leyte Gulf again scored a massive victory for the U.S. Navy in what would become the largest naval battle in history. Not only would the U.S. Marines be able to retake the island of Leyte, but the Japanese suffered its greatest loss of ships and crew ever. It was also allowed for the U.S. to retake the Philippine Islands and cut off Japan from its territories in Southeast Asia, which had provided it with oil. It effectively ended the use of the Japanese Navy for the remainder of the war, except for a single suicidal attack towards the end of the war in April 1945, again, which they lost. At the start of 1945, Japan's government knew very well that they were going to lose the war, but with a culture where surrender was dishonorable, they refused to do so. And so they began to draw up plans to defend their home islands using civilians, not only to fight, but also as suicide bombs and as human shields. In one of the first steps to invading the Japanese mainland, the United States had to invade the volcanic island of Iwo Jima, where the Japanese had built in heavy fortifications and tunnels into the side of the dormant volcano there, named Mount Suribachi. Iwo Jima would become one of the bloodiest and most infamous victories for the United States Marine Corps during a 5-week-long battle. It was at the top of Mount Suribachi where the iconic photo of the Marines raising the flag became one of the most famous photographs in history. On Iwo Jima alone, there would be 27 Medals of Honor awarded to the Marines and Navy sailors who had fought and died on the island. Again, the Americans saw the brutal resolve of the Japanese forces to never surrender when they moved on to the island of Okinawa. Okinawa was the closest the Americans had ever fought to the Japanese mainland, and the fighting there would last for nearly 3 months. During that battle, the Japanese resorted to using civilians as shields and suicide bombers. Short of ammo and food, Japanese soldiers also sharpened bamboo into spears and attacked the Marines in massive suicidal banzai charges. It is estimated that 110,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians were killed in the battle, while America lost 14,000 soldiers and sailors. After the defeat of Japan on Okinawa, the Allies demanded the complete and unconditional surrender of Japan. It was agreed by the Allied powers that should Japan refuse to surrender, and I quote, "The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction," end quote. The refusal to surrender resulted in the United States dropping 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The Soviet Union also began its invasion of Manchuria, which quickly defeated the largest part of the Japanese army. Finally, on August 15th, Japan surrendered unconditionally, and the war was over. Alright, so just to remind you, at the end of this week, you guys will be having a quiz on everything we've learned about World War II so far, including this video on the Pacific Theater. So make sure that you guys study, and I will see you guys next time. Take care.